When my father's voice cut through that room, it didn't sound angry. It sounded final, the way a judge sounds when he's already decided you're guilty. He looked at me, then past me, as if I'd been a mistake he'd lived with too long. My daughter, he said, forgot what honor means. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel. It was polite. The kind of laughter people use when they want to keep their distance from someone's shame. I sat there, hands still, face calm, the way he taught me, the way that always pleased him. But inside, something cracked, quiet, clean, irreversible. I realized he would rather protect his image than remember who I was. And I'd spent years mistaking that for love. That night, for the first time, I didn't swallow the words burning in my throat. I didn't defend him. I didn't cry. I just promised myself one thing, that one day, when the truth finally spoke, it wouldn't whisper. It would make him listen. I never thought I would come back to Baltimore. Yet there I was, sitting at the farthest end of the Baltimore Harbor Convention Center, hiding behind a row of crisp uniforms and shining medals. The lights on the stage were too bright, the air too heavy with formality and praise. The banners, the speeches, the practiced smiles, all of it felt rehearsed, as if honor itself were something that could be scripted. My father stood at the center of it, Admiral Thomas Rowe, every headline's definition of legacy and discipline. 2 decades of service, the announcer said. 2 decades of influence. 2 decades of a man who never once looked back to see who he had left behind. When the lights hit him, the crowd quieted as if someone had issued a command. The medals on his chest caught the light, glinting in hard, cold flashes. He adjusted the microphone, and I recognized the gesture. The same one he'd used before speaking to a room full of subordinates. That small, precise movement that told everyone, "Listen, I am in control." His voice filled the hall, deep and deliberate. Some people forget what honor means. He paused, long enough for the weight of the words to hang. Then, with a faint smile, he added, "Even in their own family." The room responded exactly as he knew it would. Soft laughter, polite and uneasy. No one dared look my way, but I could feel the sideways glances cutting across the rows. The laughter wasn't cruel, not really. It was the kind of laughter people use to protect themselves. From discomfort, from guilt, from truth. I sat still, hands folded tightly in my lap. Stillness had always been the safest way to survive him, but my stomach clenched anyway, my pulse drumming beneath the calm surface. I told myself it was just another speech, another performance in his endless act of perfection. But this one stung differently. He wasn't just pretending I didn't exist. He was using me to prove that his world was flawless. He turned, resting a firm, fatherly hand on the shoulder of the young man beside him. Commander Beck Hayes, his protege, his mirror image, the soldier he'd always wanted for a son. Beck stood tall in his dark uniform, the kind of composed confidence that cameras love. "Beck here," my father said, "is the kind of son any officer would be proud of." Applause erupted again. A few people stood. Pride rippled through the hall like a carefully timed wave. My father smiled, the kind of smile that belonged to men who never questioned their place in the world. I looked at him, and for a moment, I almost felt pity. He had built a lifetime of walls, medals, and speeches to protect himself from something he couldn't control. Me. Beck's expression shifted as the applause died down. He turned his head slightly, just enough that his eyes found mine across the crowded room. There was recognition there, hesitation. His lips parted, barely moving. Black Widow. The words slipped out like a ghost, soundless to everyone else, but sharp enough to slice through the air between us. My body went rigid, my breath caught. That name had been buried years ago, locked away in classified silence. No one should have known it. No one but 6 men who'd walked out of a desert alive. My fingers curled around the strap of my bag until they ached. Memories I'd buried under years of quiet duty and obedience surged up. Uninvited. The voice of command radios. The smell of burnt sand. The deafening static right before I broke every rule to save lives. And then, My father's signature on the purge order that made it all disappear. He stood there now, basking in applause, haloed by white light, worshipped for integrity. The crowd saw a man of principle. I saw the man who had erased me to keep his image intact. My eyes caught the glint of his metal again, silver, hard-edged, reflecting the light like a blade. The irony was too clean, too cruel. The man who preached about honor had traded truth for applause. For years, I'd told myself that silence was safer, that keeping my head down was the price of survival. But as I watched him soak in the adoration of a room built on lies, I understood what my mother meant when she said silence doesn't protect, it corrodes. Beck looked away first, jaw tight, shoulders squared. The whisper still echoed in my chest like a detonated secret. Black Widow. 2 words that shouldn't have survived. 2 words that cracked open everything I'd spent years trying to seal shut. My father lifted his glass, smiling into the crowd. They cheered, cameras flashed, and I sat there, invisible again, but not silent, not anymore. He thought silence would save him, but silence remembers. I stood, my chair scraping softly against the polished floor. A few heads turned, curious, confused, but I didn't care. I walked out before the applause could die, before he could see that something inside me had shifted. Behind me, the sound of clapping filled the air, bright, hollow, metallic, like metals hitting a stone floor, like the sound of everything I'd lost finding its way back to me. Outside, the night air bit cold against my skin. The echo of his voice still lingered, heavy and familiar. But now, it didn't paralyze me, it fueled me. The truth had been buried once. It wouldn't stay buried again. The house in Annapolis still stood like a monument to control. From the outside, it looked almost peaceful. White walls, trimmed hedges, the flagpost perfectly aligned with the porch. But inside, every inch of it was a reminder of how order could suffocate. The floors gleamed like a mirror, and even the air carried a stillness that demanded permission to move. Everything had its place, and I learned early that feelings did not. When I was a child, I believed the house could hear me breathe. If I made too much noise, it seemed to hold its breath until I stopped. My father's presence filled every room, even when he wasn't there. His rules echoed through the halls long after his footsteps faded. Stand straight, shoulders back, no crying in this house. I learned those words before I learned to spell them. I thought they were the commandments of love. He never shouted. He never had to. Discipline was his native tongue, and silence was the punctuation mark at the end of every sentence. If I dropped a fork, if I hesitated before answering, he'd only glance up from his papers, one look, and I'd correct myself. Even now, years later, that instinct hadn't left me. The only softness that ever breached the walls of that house came from my mother, Marjorie. Her voice had a quiet melody that could turn even his rules into background noise. She taught high school history and believed that bravery didn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes, she said, it came in the shape of gentleness, or truth told at the wrong time. She would leave little folded notes in my books, always written in the same looping script. Find your own coordinates. Truth is not rebellion. The sea remembers what men forget. I used to keep those notes under my pillow, as if they were some kind of permission slip to be human. She'd smile when she caught me reading them, pretending not to notice that I hid them from him. After she died, the house changed. It didn't just become quieter, it became hollow. He filled the space with more rules, as if structure could hold back grief. I remember the day I found the envelope, sealed and yellowing, tucked inside her desk drawer. For Thomas. He never opened it. When I asked why, he didn't even look up. Don't touch things that don't concern the mission, he said. I was 17 then, old enough to understand that his silence wasn't strength. It was fear dressed as authority. He hadn't just lost his wife that day. He'd lost the part of himself that could listen, or care, or see me. After that, our conversations were short, transactional. I spoke. He looked away. I tried to explain. He countered with rules. The older I got, the less oxygen the house seemed to have. Words could barely survive there. I left for school as soon as I could, thinking distance would make him smaller. It didn't. His voice had already taken root inside me. Years later, when I joined Naval Intelligence, I told myself I was doing it for me, but that was a lie I needed to believe. I wanted him to notice. I wanted to speak his language, the language of discipline, logic, command. I thought if I mastered it, he might finally hear me. Instead, the opposite happened. He came to my graduation ceremony, sat in the front row in full uniform, medals gleaming. He didn't smile. When my name was called, he clapped twice, measured, polite, as though applauding a stranger who happened to carry his last name. Later, he told someone near him that I'd make a fine analyst if I didn't let sentiment cloud judgment. That was the closest thing to pride I ever got from him. For a long time, I tried to convince myself that it was enough, that a glance, a nod, a sentence stripped of warmth could still mean approval. But late at night, when I was alone, I'd unfold one of my mother's notes, the paper soft from years of handling, and trace the words with my thumb. Find your own coordinates. She'd known, even then, that I'd spend my life trying to locate myself on a map drawn by someone else. Sometimes, I'd stand by the window and look at the bay. The water there was a strange kind of blue, flat, obedient, reflecting only what it was given. I wondered if my father looked at me the same way he looked at the sea. Something meant to be commanded, not understood. It wasn't that he hated me. Hatred would have been easier to bear. It was that I didn't fit into his design. I was an equation that refused to balance, a version of discipline he couldn't quantify. When I was 23, I took my first post under Naval Intelligence Command. Walking through the gates that day, I felt something familiar in the air, the same sharp order I'd grown up under. For a moment, it almost felt like home. I told myself I was doing this to serve, but deep down, I knew the truth. I wanted him to see me, if only for a second. If I spoke in code, in rank, in strategy, if I obeyed as flawlessly as he had, maybe he'd finally turn his head and say the words I'd never heard. He didn't. When the letter of assignment reached his desk, he didn't congratulate me. He didn't call. The next time we met, months later, he looked at my insignia and said, "Be careful who you listen to out there." That was all. I remember nodding, smiling faintly, pretending it was advice. But as I walked away, I realized something. He had built an entire life around commanding people to listen. And yet, he'd never once learned how to hear. Every choice I made after that was an echo of that silence. Every victory felt muted, every success rehearsed, as if I was chasing approval that would never come. But there's a peculiar thing about living in a house ruled by silence. You either become like it, or you learn to use it as a weapon. I didn't know it then, but the silence he'd taught me would one day be the only thing that could undo him. The mission came in my second summer on duty. We called it Operation Raven Gate, an extraction and reconnaissance assignment in Somalia that was supposed to last 12 hours. It turned into a night the Navy never wanted to talk about again. The team on the ground was Bravo, a 6-man SEAL unit running deep inland. Somewhere between transmission updates, their signal vanished. The live feed froze, then rebooted with coordinates that didn't make sense, an impossible loop that sent them straight into enemy range. At first, we thought it was a glitch in the relay, but glitches don't rewrite encrypted data. Someone was manipulating the feed. I was in the command room that night, surrounded by radar screens and the hum of machines that never slept. The air was cold enough to sting my throat each time I spoke. My commanding officer barked orders through a headset, every sentence louder than the last, while the tech team scrambled to recalibrate. I sat still, watching the dots blink and disappear. I'd learned long ago that panic was useless. Noise made people sloppy. So I tuned out the shouting, focused on the patterns. The false data came from an internal relay, someone inside the network, not the SEALs, not us, a leak. When the system refused to respond to override commands, I switched channels manually. It was a risk, if I was wrong. I'd be feeding them straight into a kill zone. But the math didn't lie. The radar was showing ghost coordinates. "This is Widow," I said over the backup frequency. "Team Bravo, move east, 200 meters." There was static, then gunfire, then silence. For a long minute, I thought I'd sent them straight into hell. I stared at the screen, at the single red dot that marked their position. Then, through the noise, a man's voice came back, steady, controlled. "Copy that. Widow!" It was the first time anyone had said the name out loud. Widow. I'd taken it as a call sign months earlier. An inside joke from a training simulation. Cold, efficient, detached. That night, it became real. Hours passed. The command center emptied. I stayed, listening to the distant chatter of returning aircraft. Just before dawn, a message came through. 6 survivors en route to extraction point. No casualties. The relief didn't come with celebration. It came with exhaustion. The kind that seeps into your bones and makes you forget what it feels like to breathe easy. The operation had failed on paper, but men were alive. That should have been enough. It wasn't. By morning, the official report circulated. Operation Ravengate. Failure. Cause: internal leak. No mention of the rescue signal. No mention of Bravo Team's survival. Just a tidy summary that erased everything that didn't fit the Navy's version of order. At noon, my system access was revoked. I couldn't log in, couldn't even see my own reports. An officer from HR showed up at my desk with a neutral face and a sealed folder. Inside was a reassignment notice and a formal request for a debrief. By afternoon, I was standing outside my father's office at headquarters. I didn't need to knock. He always knew when I was coming. He was standing by the window, hands behind his back, uniform pressed sharp enough to cut glass. The folder on his desk bore my name. The paper on top was stamped purge file. His signature ran clean across the bottom. I looked at it, then at him. Why? He didn't look at me right away. His voice was calm, precise, practiced. The tone of command I'd grown up obeying. No daughter of mine will be part of a scandal. I felt the air thicken between us, the same way it did before a storm. You'd rather erase me than let the truth breathe? He finally turned. His expression was flat, but there was something behind it, something I couldn't name. The Navy doesn't need your voice. I wanted to tell him that I hadn't spoken for myself that night. I'd spoken for 6 men who would have died in the dark if I hadn't broken the rules he worshipped. But I didn't say anything. There was no point. He'd already decided what truth was allowed to exist. He turned back to the window, his reflection framed by the flag outside, swaying in the wind. I waited for him to say more, to explain, to sound like a father instead of an officer. He didn't. When I finally left the building, the hallways felt longer than they ever had. The click of my shoes on the tile sounded too loud. I could almost hear him behind me, measuring the rhythm, waiting for me to adjust it to his pace. That night, I sat alone in the barracks, the sound of the sea threading through the walls. The smell of salt water mixed with the faint tang of machine oil, familiar, grounding, unbearable. My mother used to say the sea remembers. I hadn't understood it as a child. Back then, I thought she meant that the tides carried echoes. Now I knew she meant that truth has its own current. You can push it down for a while, but it always finds a way back to shore. I whispered into the dark, barely a sound, just enough for the waves to carry. So do I. Then I closed my eyes and listened to the surf until the sound became steady again, like a heartbeat I could borrow, a promise that silence would not have the last word. The call came just after the ceremony ended, his voice steady and unbothered, as if nothing had happened. He didn't ask if I was all right, or how I'd felt sitting through his public display. He simply gave an order: "You'll come to the dinner," for appearance's sake. There was no room to refuse him. There never had been, not when every senior officer in the city would be there to toast the man they called a legend. So I went. The officers' club in downtown Baltimore smelled of cigars, leather, and money. The walls were paneled in dark wood, polished until they shone like oil. Brass lamps hung low, casting an amber glow that softened the faces of men who had spent their lives believing they owned the word honor. When I walked in, the conversation faltered. It lasted only a few seconds, but I noticed it. The quick recognition, the awkward shifting. The way they all pretended not to stare. My father sat at the head of the long table, posture rigid, the centerpiece of his own myth. His metal caught the light with each small movement. He didn't rise. He didn't need to. "Callista," he said, with that thin, practiced smile. "Didn't think you'd still remember protocol." I pulled out a chair at the far end of the table, meeting his eyes just long enough to make sure he knew I wasn't there to perform. "I remember everything," I said. Dinner began with a round of toasts. Laughter, the clink of glasses, the rhythm of a room full of men who believed themselves invincible. I watched the way his hand tightened around his glass each time someone mentioned the word failure. I caught the brief flickers of discomfort when younger officers glanced between us. The conversation was beginning to drift when a voice broke the rhythm. A young lieutenant, too eager to prove he belonged. "Ma'am," he asked, "you worked in naval intelligence, right? Weren't you part of Operation Ravengate?" The air in the room changed. Forks froze mid-air. Someone cleared his throat. My father's expression didn't move, but his shoulders straightened. A fraction of an inch. The subtle signal that said control was his again. He laughed, soft but sharp. "No, she just read about it in a textbook." The table erupted with polite laughter. I heard the metallic scrape of a knife on porcelain, the rhythmic clink of a glass being turned in someone's hand. My father reached for his drink, smiling as if he hadn't just erased me again. I wanted to speak, to tell them how it really happened, how 6 men had walked out of that desert alive because someone broke the right rule at the right time. But I stayed quiet, across the table. Beck Hayes sat with his back straight, jaw locked. His hands rested on either side of his glass, motionless, until the faint tremor gave him away. The rest of the meal was a blur of meaningless chatter. Promotions, transfers, someone's daughter's wedding, someone else's divorce. When the coffee was poured and the cigars appeared, I stood before my father could summon that thin smile again. I turned and walked out, the click of my heels echoing in the corridor behind me. The hallway outside was dim, the floor shining with reflections of amber light. The night smelled faintly of salt drifting in from the harbor. I had almost reached the doors when a voice stopped me. "Call sign, Black Widow." I froze. Beck stood a few feet away, still in his uniform, a phone in his hand. The screen flickered, cracked in one corner, glowing weakly in the dark. From the small speaker came a rush of static, then the sharp crack of gunfire, and my own voice, steady, calm, too measured for the chaos around it. Then, through the noise, a male voice answered. "Copy that, Widow, moving." My throat closed. For a second, the air felt too thin to breathe. He watched me, his face unreadable, but his eyes told the story. He didn't have to ask if it was me. He already knew. "It was you," he said quietly. "You saved us." I managed to steady my breath, forcing the tremor out of my voice, and my father erased it. He tightened his grip on the phone. His knuckles went white. "They said the operation failed," he said, "but 6 of us came home." "Failures don't usually breathe," I replied. He laughed once, a small, bitter sound. "If they lied once, they'll keep lying. But now, we've got a voice." I looked at him, the man my father had called the kind of son any officer would be proud of. "Then let's find the truth," I said. His expression shifted, somewhere between warning and resolve. "You ready to dig through ghosts?" I met his eyes. "I've lived with them long enough." The lights from the dining room spilled faintly into the hall, glinting off the brass fixtures and his cracked phone screen. Beyond the doors, the noise of celebration rose again, but the world had already started to crack. They just didn't know it yet. I didn't sleep that night. The sound of my own voice kept looping in my head. It wasn't the sound of courage. It was survival. Yet hearing it again, from that broken phone, made something inside me shift. Part of me wanted to destroy it, to delete the recording, wipe every trace of that night, and let the past finally rot in the dark where my father had buried it. But another part, quieter, stronger, wanted to keep it alive. Not to gloat. Not for revenge. just to prove that I had existed, that my voice had once mattered. By dawn, the city was pale and empty, the harbor air sharp with salt. I sat by the window, watching the fog crawl across the water, until a knock came at my door. Beck stood there, holding 2 cups of coffee. He didn't say good morning. He didn't need to. I could tell from his eyes that he hadn't slept either. They had the focus of someone who'd already made a choice that couldn't be undone. He handed me the cup. The coffee too hot, too bitter. Just right. I checked the archives. He said, Raven Gate's file isn't deleted. It's sealed. Classified level Omega. My stomach tightened. I asked him what that meant, though I already knew. Only one man has access. I didn't have to ask which man. His silence answered for him. Admiral Thomas Rowe. The room fell still. Somewhere outside, a gull screamed over the water, then was swallowed by the wind. If we open that file, Beck said quietly, we'll burn your father's legacy. It was built on ashes anyway, I told him. He looked at me for a long moment, like he was searching for something. Hesitation. Maybe. Or doubt. But there wasn't any left in me. We left before noon, driving toward Annapolis. The sky stretched wide and cloudless, that washed out Maryland blue that made everything look too clean, too honest. Beck drove in silence, his focus absolute, while I stared out the window, tracing the blur of the coastline. Every mile between Baltimore and Annapolis felt like a return to something I'd spent my whole life running from. By the time we reached the Naval Academy gates, the sun was starting to dip. The guard at the checkpoint recognized Beck's credentials immediately. The archives were buried beneath the main building, a labyrinth of concrete and steel, chilled to preserve the records of men who'd never be questioned. The elevator dropped slow, the hum low and constant, like descending into the lungs of a sleeping giant. When the doors opened, I could smell metal and cold paper. Rows upon rows of steel drawers stretched into the distance, each labeled with neat black letters. Beck walked ahead, scanning the section numbers until we reached the one-stamped Raven Gate incident report. You sure about this? I've been sure since the day he called me shame. The cabinet door was locked, fingerprint protected, coded for high-level clearance. Beck typed the command sequence, his fingers moving fast and precise. The panel lit up red. Access denied. He tried again. Same result. I reached out and laid my hand on the cold metal, tracing the edge of the keypad. He really locked me out of my own life. I whispered. Beck didn't answer. He just reached into his jacket and pulled out a small encrypted drive. I copied this from my mission debrief, he said. He plugged it in. The monitor blinked once, then filled with white static. For a moment, it looked like it might work, until the words appeared, sharp and final. Access denied. User, a DM Rowe. A laugh escaped me before I could stop it, dry and humorless. Of course. Even ghosts in this place obey him. Beck stared at the screen, his jaw tight. We left the file unopened. For now. On the drive back, the silence between us wasn't heavy, it was loaded. The road curved along the water, the sunset bleeding gold and crimson across the bay. The reflection shimmered on the windshield, cutting across Beck's face like a half-shadow. I finally broke the quiet. Why are you helping me? You could lose everything for this. He didn't look away from the road. Because once, I heard a voice in the dark telling me which way to run. I didn't ask who she was. Now I know. I can't stay quiet. The wind from the open window tangled my hair. Annapolis drifted past outside. White boats, tidy streets, flags flapping in perfect order. Everything looked so clean it made me sick. I drove through the night toward Annapolis, headlights cutting through the dark like a blade. The wind off the Chesapeake slammed against the windshield, cold and sharp, as if the air itself wanted to keep me away. By the time I reached the old house, the sky had turned the color of steel. It looked exactly the same, white, still, and silent, like a ghost that refused to fade. The porch light was on, though I doubted it had been turned on for me. I didn't knock. The door was never locked. Control had always been his idea of security. The sound of my boots echoed across the polished floors. That same wooden rhythm I'd heard my whole childhood. back when footsteps in this house meant inspection, not welcome. I followed the faint light down the hall until I reached the map room. He was there, of course, standing at the center of it all, hands clasped behind his back, staring at a world reduced to borders and coordinates. His posture hadn't changed, a soldier frozen in command. His voice broke the silence without turning toward me. "You could have called." The same tone he used when I was 10, arriving late from school, or when I forgot to salute the way he wanted. Calm, heavy, and carved from expectation. Maps. Dozens of them. Layers of oceans and routes. Latitude lines like veins connecting every place he'd ever controlled from a distance. And there, in the center of the Horn of Africa, was a small red dot. "That's where you erased me," I said. He didn't turn around. His voice came low and even. "You broke chain of command, and you broke your daughter." The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Then he turned, slowly. His face was pale under the yellow light, the lines deeper than I remembered. But his eyes, cold, controlled, were exactly the same. "That night, there was a leak. A real one. You weren't the cause, but someone had to take the fall. So you offered me up. You don't understand politics. Callista, they would have torn you apart. I made sure they couldn't. You made sure no one could ever hear me again." His jaw tightened. He stepped closer to the table, fingers brushing the edge as if the map itself could justify him. "I did what a leader had to do." "No, Dad. You did what a coward had to do." He flinched, not visibly enough for anyone else to see. But I'd spent a lifetime learning his tells. The twitch in his jaw, the shallow breath, the brief shift of weight from one foot to the other. I walked to the table and picked up the old brass ruler lying across the map. Its edges were smooth, worn by decades of use. I held it like a blade and pointed at that same red dot in Somalia. One decision, one lie, and the whole map of my life shifted. He said nothing. For once, he didn't have a rule or a command to throw between us. "Do you even remember what she wrote in the letter you never opened?" His eyes flickered, just for a second. But I saw it. The smallest fracture. "Don't bring your mother into this. She's been in this from the beginning." I set the ruler down, the sound of metal striking wood sharp enough to split the air. "You built this room to control the world," I said. "Every pin, every chart, every line. It's all a monument to how you thought obedience could keep you safe. But the only thing it ever did was make you deaf." He looked at me, the stiffness of command faltering. For the first time, I could see the man behind the medals. Not the admiral, not the strategist. Just the father who didn't know how to love anything that couldn't be ordered. "You taught me silence was strength," I said quietly. But all it ever did was make me disappear. I turned toward the door. My footsteps echoed down the hall again, and I realized that even the sound of leaving felt like defiance. Behind me, his voice came, cracked and low, metal rusting in the dark. "Callista." I stopped, hand on the doorframe, but didn't turn. "I never stopped watching over you." "Then you should have watched closer." The air between us stayed still for a long moment, full of everything we'd never said. Then I stepped out, closing the door behind me. The latch clicked softly, the sound final, almost ceremonial. Outside, the wind off the bay hit my face, sharp and salt-heavy. The house behind me stood quiet again, its lights glowing faint through the mist. For years, I'd believed silence was survival. But walking away that night, I realized silence was only another way to stay caged, and I was done being silent. 2 days later, I met Eleanor Decker at a cafe off King George Street. We hadn't spoken in years, not since before the Navy made me vanish off its record. She looked exactly the same, sharp eyes, hair pulled back, a kind of stillness that came from always weighing what to say and what to withhold. She slid a thin folder across the table, the paper whispering against the wood. "There's a classified file still stored in the Naval Archives," she said. "If you open it, you'll have to be ready to destroy his career. He destroyed mine first." I told her. Eleanor sighed. her fingers tracing the edge of the folder. And what if he had a reason? Then let him say it out loud. The ride to the Naval Archives was quiet. The air was gray, heavy with that pre-storm humidity that makes everything feel fragile. Beck drove with both hands on the wheel, eyes flicking to the mirrors every few seconds. Even in civilian clothes, he couldn't shed the soldier in him. When we reached the entrance beneath the Naval Academy, the security guard barely glanced at him. Beck's clearance still carried weight. "You still want to do this?" he asked as we stepped out of the car. "I've wanted to since the day he signed that order." The air inside the archives was freezing. The concrete walls and metallic floors made the space feel more like a laboratory than a library. Rows of steel cabinets stretched out like a grid, each drawer labeled in neat block letters. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Beck moved quickly, navigating the aisles with purpose. We passed labels I recognized, operations that had shaped history, and some that had never been meant to see daylight. Then, finally, there it was. Operation Raven Gate, classified level Omega. A keypad and fingerprint scanner gleamed faintly on the drawer's front panel. Beck entered his clearance code and pressed his thumb against the pad. The machine beeped once, then flashed red. "Access, a DM, T, row." Beck tried again, slower this time. Nothing. I stared at the name on the screen. That title like a seal over my life. I ran my fingers along the edge of the cabinet. I knelt down, tracing the seam beneath the Navy insignia until my nail caught on something. A small groove, just wide enough for a fingertip. I pressed it, and a faint mechanical click answered. "The lock released." Beck blinked in surprise. "You remember his tricks, huh?" I didn't answer. I pulled the drawer open. Inside, a thick folder sat in a plastic sleeve marked in red ink. "Purged copy. Confidential." My hands shook, but I forced them still. I opened the file. The first page stopped me cold. Incident report filed by Lieutenant K. Rowe. Unacknowledged. Mission outcome, 6 survivors. Order of deletion, Admiral T. Rowe. Beck leaned closer, reading over my shoulder. His expression changed. First disbelief, then something quieter, heavier. "You were the reason we lived," he said softly. Andy knew. I swallowed hard. He didn't erase me to save me. He did it to save himself. The sound hit us before we saw the lights. An alarm, sharp and mechanical. Red strobes flashed against the walls. Eleanor's voice came over the intercom from the security booth. "We have to go." Beck grabbed the folder, tucking it inside his jacket. We ran, boots pounding against the slick metal floor. The corridor twisted sharply toward the stairwell, and there, at the top of the stairs, stood Thomas Rowe. He wasn't in uniform this time, just a white dress shirt, sleeves rolled up, his age finely visible in the tremor of his hands. "You think this makes you right?" he said. "No. It just makes me seen." His voice rose, rough around the edges. "Callista, that file could tear down more than my name. It could ruin everything I built. Then maybe it was built on the wrong foundation." Beck stepped forward, placing himself between us, his voice steady but low. "With respect, sir, maybe it's time we stop protecting silence and start protecting truth." My father's face tightened. "You have no idea what that truth costs. Then you shouldn't have sold it so cheap," I said. For a moment, no one moved. The alarms wailed, red light pulsing across his face. He looked at me like he was seeing a ghost he didn't know how to fight. I brushed past him, the air thick with everything that would never be said. He didn't stop me. He didn't reach out. But as I reached the door, I heard him speak again, voice breaking in a way I'd never heard before. "You sound just like your mother." I paused, turning back for the first time. "That's the first compliment you've ever given me." His mouth twitched, but no words followed. I left him there, standing alone in the flashing red light. Outside, the night hit us like a wave. Beck and I didn't speak as we sprinted to the car. He drove hard, headlights slicing through the dark, the folder clutched in my hands like a pulse. The city lights began to rise in the distance. Only then did he break the silence. "What will you do with it?" I stared out the window. the reflection of red and blue lights chasing across the glass. "Tell the truth," I said. "Even if it burns everything." He didn't answer, and he didn't need to. The sound of the engine filled the silence, steady and relentless, like the sea remembering what men try to forget. I had never been afraid of light, but standing in the great hall of the U.S. Naval Academy that afternoon, I felt its weight pressing down on me, bright, merciless, and exposing. Sunlight streamed through the tall glass ceiling, spilling over the rows of medals, pressed uniforms, and polished shoes. It felt like the entire room was waiting for me to fracture. They called his name. The applause came like thunder, loud, practiced, loyal. Admiral Thomas Rowe, 12 medals glinting against his chest, each one catching the light like armor. He walked up to the podium with that same measured confidence I'd grown up under, the rhythm of command in every step. He began to speak, his voice calm and deliberate, honed by decades of ceremony. Words like honor, duty, legacy rolled off his tongue as easily as breath. "Legacy," he said, "is not just what we build, it's what we protect." From the back row, I watched his hands, steady, controlled. Beside me, Beck sat motionless, one hand resting on his phone. We had rehearsed this moment until the plan became muscle memory. When my father began his next line, praising the unbroken brotherhood of command, Beck rose. The microphone caught the sound of his chair scraping against the floor. "Permission to play a recording, sir," he said, his tone steady, respectful. My father stopped mid-sentence. His eyes narrowed. "This is highly irregular." So was that night in Somalia. Beck lifted the phone, pressed the button, and let it play. At first, there was only static. Then, my own voice filled the hall, stronger than I remembered it, clearer, untouched by the weight of silence. "This is Widow. I've got your signal. Move east, 200 meters." The sound echoed against the high ceilings. Every breath, every crackle of gunfire, every second of that night seemed to come alive again. Then came Beck's voice from the recording. "Copy that. Widow." And then, silence. Real silence. No whispers. No movement. No applause. I watched him freeze. The medals on his chest caught the light again, but they no longer looked like honor. They looked heavy, like chains. His jaw tightened. He cleared his throat, reaching for control, for authority. "That voice disobeyed orders," he said. "It compromised the mission." Beck stepped forward, the distance between them closing to a single heartbeat. "It saved 6 lives, sir, including mine." My father's composure wavered, just enough for the mask to crack. He looked out over the crowd, his command slipping from his grasp. I rose. The movement drew every gaze in the room. Sunlight from the glass ceiling caught on the edge of my hair, casting a faint glow across the floor. I didn't need a microphone. The sound of my voice carried clean and sure. "You buried the truth because you thought silence was control. But silence doesn't protect. It corrodes." The room stayed still. Rows of uniforms shifted as people turned to look between us, father and daughter, admiral and ghost. His voice came out rough, stripped of its practiced calm. "You think you know what honor is?" I met his eyes. I learned it from the only person who ever had it, Mom. The name hit him like a blow. For a second, he couldn't breathe. His lips parted as if to speak. But nothing came. The crowd didn't react, not yet. Then, slowly, one man stood, an older officer near the front, his hand pressed over his chest. Another followed, then another, until the entire hall was on its feet. No one clapped, no one spoke. The silence grew heavy, dense, and reverent. My father looked around the room, his kingdom, and found no one willing to laugh, no one willing to look away. The medals on his chest no longer gleamed. They hung like weights pulling him down. For the first time in my life, he seemed small. He reached up, unfastened the clasp on his uniform, and removed the row of medals. The metal clicked softly against the podium as he laid them down. That sound, sharp, final, was louder than the applause that had welcomed him moments before. "Maybe," he said quietly. "I forgot what honor means." The sunlight shifted through the glass. landing across his shoulders. It didn't look like glory anymore. It looked like surrender. Beck turned toward me. His hand still held the phone, but he didn't need it now. Every camera in the room had already captured the truth. I looked at my father one last time, the man who had traded his humanity for perfection. For a moment, I thought he might look at me, not as a threat, not as a scandal, but as his daughter. He didn't. And yet, I knew something had changed. Not victory, not forgiveness. Something quieter. A fracture in the image he'd spent a lifetime protecting. The sound of boots shifting against the floor filled the air as the ceremony dissolved into uneasy silence. My father's voice had finally failed him. Mine, the one he'd erased, was now echoing across every device in the building. I turned to leave. Beck fell into step beside me, his face unreadable but steady, behind us. The light poured through the glass, spilling across the empty podium where the medals lay. Outside, the wind carried the faint hum of the Academy's bells. Somewhere, in offices and command rooms across the country, the recording was already being replayed, analyzed, broadcast. The truth was out, and this time, it had my name on it. I left the hall before the clapping could find a rhythm again. It wasn't for me, and it wasn't for him. It was for the truth that had finally been spoken out loud, for once. Unfiltered, unapproved, unburied. Outside, the air was sharp, the kind that carried the smell of salt and iron from the Chesapeake. I drove in silence, the city lights thinning out behind me until the road dissolved into darkness and water. The closer I got to the house, the heavier the quiet became, like the night itself was holding its breath. The house stood exactly as I remembered. White siding streaked with salt, windows staring blankly toward the bay. Once, it had felt like a fortress. Tonight, it felt like the last ghost still standing. Inside, the air was stale with disuse. The clock on the mantel had stopped years ago. I didn't bother to turn on the lights. The moon through the bay window was enough. On the old desk sat the letter, my mother's handwriting faint, the paper soft from years of folding and unfolding. For Thomas. I had read it once before, the night I found it tucked in the back of her drawer, but this time, the words landed differently. Thomas, she doesn't need your rank to rise. She already carries her own. When silence becomes pride, it kills what it was meant to protect. Her handwriting trembled toward the end, the ink lighter where her hand must have faltered. I could almost hear her voice, the calm cadence she used when speaking to both of us. I folded the letter carefully, tracing her signature with my thumb, and set it back on the desk. That's when I heard it. The faint crunch of gravel outside. A car door closing. I didn't have to look. I knew who it was. The door opened quietly, and his footsteps followed, slow, deliberate. When he appeared in the doorway, he wasn't wearing the uniform. The medals were gone. The lines in his face seemed deeper, but for once, there was no command in his posture. He looked at the letter first. Not at me. His eyes softened, and for the briefest moment, I saw something unfamiliar there. Regret. Maybe. Or exhaustion that had finally caught up. She always believed you'd rise, he said. I just didn't know how to let you. You didn't let me. Dad, you buried me, and still, you rose. His voice cracked on that last word. He sat down slowly, the chair creaking under his weight, and placed a new envelope on the desk beside my mother's letter. His hand trembled slightly when he let go. I sent this to the Pentagon, the records being reinstated. They'll know what you did. I stared at the envelope but didn't touch it. You don't need to fix the record, I said. You needed to read the letter. He smiled, small, uncertain, almost human, the kind of smile that made me realize how rare it was to see his face without armor. Maybe I'm just learning to listen. The words hung between us like something fragile. He looked out toward the window, where the waves hit the rocks in slow rhythm. His shoulders loosened. I could see the man he might have been before medals taught him how to disappear behind silence. I sat down across from him. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The wind outside rattled the old shutters, the bay answering in slow, even breaths. It was the same silence I'd known my whole life, but now it felt different. Not punishment, not distance, just stillness. He looked at me once more, and for the first time, his eyes didn't demand anything. They only held acknowledgement, an unspoken admission of everything he couldn't say out loud. We stayed like that, the two of us sitting in the room where everything had once begun and ended. The sound of the sea filled the spaces where words would have been. I thought of my mother again, her steady faith in both of us, her belief that truth always found a way back to shore. Maybe she'd been right. Maybe this was what she'd meant all along. The silence between us was no longer sharp. It didn't wound or accuse. It just existed, clean, honest, earned. Outside, the tide shifted, pulling out to sea. The house creaked softly, the wind pressing against its walls like an exhale. And for the first time, the quiet didn't hurt. It felt like peace. A year had passed. The air was colder now, the kind that cuts through layers no matter how long you stand in it. The morning sky over Arlington was a muted gray, the kind of gray that holds both peace and memory. Rows of white chairs faced the sea, the horizon faint beneath a thin veil of mist. I stood toward the back, where the ground sloped gently toward the water. The wind carried the faint scent of salt and pine, mixing with the polished metal of folded flags. The ceremony had already begun. Beck stood at the podium, his posture still military straight, his voice low and deliberate. He read the names slowly, one by one, with the reverence of someone who understood the weight behind each syllable. They were the names of men who died in places most people couldn't pronounce. And then, his tone shifted. And to the strategist known as Black Widow, he said, the wind caught his words, scattering them just enough that they seemed to belong to the air itself. The one who saved lives when no one even knew she existed. No applause followed. No sound but the whisper of wind threading through the rows of flags. A few veterans rose from their seats, hands pressed over their hearts. Their movements were quiet, deliberate, respect born not from ceremony, but from understanding. The sea beyond the memorial shimmered silver under the overcast light. I let my gaze settle there, letting the cold numbness of the wind sink in. It was the kind of day that didn't demand emotion, just presence. That's when I saw him. He stood near the edge of the crowd, a little apart from everyone else. No uniform, no medals, just a gray coat buttoned to his throat. His hair was thinner now, the sharpness in his stance softened by time. He didn't move closer, didn't call my name, but when Beck lowered his head, my father raised his hand. The gesture was small, precise, unmistakable. A salute, for a heartbeat. Everything around me fell silent. The flag stopped flapping. The murmurs faded. It was just him, standing there in the cold, giving me what he'd withheld all my life. Acknowledgement. He didn't owe me an apology anymore. We both knew words wouldn't change anything. The truth had already done what it needed to do. It had leveled the ground between us. For the first time. I didn't feel like the daughter he erased. I felt like someone he finally saw. I nodded once. Not a reply. Not forgiveness. Just a quiet acceptance that this was enough. The wind picked up again, tugging at the edges of the memorial program in my hand. Beck finished reading the last name and stepped down from the podium. People began to rise, moving toward the rows of flowers and folded flags, their movements hushed and reverent. I stayed where I was, watching the water. The waves lapped gently against the seawall, silver and unhurried. Somewhere far beyond that horizon, there was a place where 6 men had once lived, because a voice they never saw had guided them out of the dark. Peace doesn't roar, I thought. It breathes quietly when truth no longer needs to defend itself. The words came and went, soft as the wind. I reached up, fingers brushing against the small pendant at my throat, the one engraved with the name that had haunted and defined me for so long. Widow. It had never been about the code name itself. It had been about what it meant. The solitude, the sacrifice, the silence I once thought was survival. Now, it was something else entirely. A chapter closing. I unclasped the chain and let the pendant rest in my palm for a moment. the metal cool and familiar. Then I drew in a breath and threw it toward the water. It spun once, caught the light, and vanished beneath the surface without a sound. No splash, no ripple, just gone, like silence itself, something I had once feared. Now an old companion I finally understood. I stayed there until the crowd began to thin, until Beck's shadow appeared beside me. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The truth had already said enough for both of us. When I turned back toward the chairs, my father was gone. Only the faint imprint of his footsteps remained in the damp grass. The tide was coming in. The air smelled of salt and clean beginnings. I slipped my hands into my coat pockets and started walking toward the car, the horizon glimmering faintly behind me.